The blood-curdling scream pierced through the humid summer air of Council Bluffs, Iowa, in 1876, stopping Zachariah Quinn dead in his tracks. He'd just arrived in town after a long cattle drive from Texas, looking for nothing more than a hot meal and a soft bed at the local boarding house. Instead, what he found was trouble the kind no decent man could walk away from. Victoria Jones had been serving drinks at the Silver Dollar Saloon for nearly 8 months now, ever since her father's death left her with nothing but debts and desperation. At 22, she had learned quickly how to dodge wandering hands and deflect unwanted attention, but tonight, Bart Hollister wasn't taking no for an answer. "I paid good money for your company, girl," Hollister snarled, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey as he grabbed a fistful of Victoria's auburn hair. "And I aim to get what I paid for." Victoria fought back tears as Hollister dragged her through the back door of the saloon, her scalp burning from the force of his grip. The few patrons who noticed looked away, unwilling to interfere with the notorious cattle baron who practically owned half the county. "Please," she begged, stumbling over her skirts as he pulled her toward the stables. "Mr. Hollister, I'm just a serving girl. I don't—" "Shut your mouth," he growled, yanking harder. It was then that a tall figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. The stranger's face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a dusty Stetson, but his stance spoke volumes, legs planted firmly, hand resting casually near the Colt revolver on his hip. "I believe the lady said no," the stranger said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. Hollister stopped, momentarily startled. "Mind your own business, cowboy. This here's between me and my paid company." The stranger stepped forward into the lamplight, revealing a weathered face with piercing blue eyes and a week's worth of stubble. "Let her go, now." "Do you know who I am?" Hollister puffed up his chest, still gripping Victoria's hair. "Don't much care," the stranger replied, his gaze never wavering. What happened next occurred so quickly Victoria could barely process it. The stranger moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, knocking Hollister's hand away and placing himself between Victoria and her attacker. Hollister stumbled backward, releasing his grip on her hair. The cowboy turned to Victoria, his eyes softening as he took in her trembling form. "You all right, madam?" She nodded, rubbing her scalp where Hollister had pulled her hair. Hollister regained his balance, rage contorting his features. He reached for the small pistol tucked in his waistband. "You're a dead man, stranger." With a movement almost too fast to follow, the cowboy drew his Colt and aimed it squarely at Hollister's chest before the cattle baron could clear his weapon. "I wouldn't." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Hollister glanced around, realizing he was now the center of unwanted attention. Slowly, he let his hand fall away from his gun. "This ain't over," he hissed, backing away. "Nobody crosses Bart Hollister." The cowboy kept his gun trained on Hollister until the man disappeared back into the saloon. Only then did he holster his weapon and turn to Victoria. "You'll never be touched like that again," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with a promise that made her breath catch. "Not while I'm around?" Victoria felt something unfamiliar stir within her, not just gratitude, but a curious warmth that spread from her chest outward. "Thank you, mister." "Quinn, Zachariah Quinn." He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Most folks just call me Zach." "Victoria Jones," she replied, extending her hand. "Everyone calls me Tori." As his calloused hand closed gently around hers, Victoria couldn't know that this chance encounter would alter the course of both their lives forever. "You shouldn't go back in there tonight," Zach said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Hollister seems the type to hold a grudge." Victoria glanced nervously at the saloon. "I don't have much choice. I need the work, and my room's above the saloon." Zach frowned, considering. "Is there somewhere else you could stay, just for tonight?" "My friend Martha runs a millinery shop on Front Street. She'd take me in, but—" Victoria hesitated, embarrassed. "I can't leave without my things, and I'm afraid to go back up there." "I'll go with you," Zach offered without hesitation. "You can get your essentials, and I'll make sure Hollister stays clear." Victoria studied him, wondering why this stranger would risk himself for her. In her experience, men always wanted something in return. Why would you help me? Zach's expression grew serious. My ma raised me to believe that a man who stands by while a woman's mistreated isn't much of a man at all. He adjusted his hat, a hint of a smile softening his features. Besides, I've never been one to back down from trouble. Something in his straightforward manner made Victoria trust him. She nodded. Thank you, Mr. Quinn. Zach, he corrected gently. They entered the saloon through the back door, Zach's presence close behind her like a protective shadow. Hollister was nowhere to be seen, though Victoria could feel the curious stares of the other patrons as they made their way to the stairs. Her room was small and sparse, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk containing her few possessions. Victoria quickly gathered her clothing, a framed photograph of her parents, and the leather-bound journal her father had given her on her 18th birthday. This is all I need, she said, tying the bundle with shaking hands. I can come back for the rest when things calm down. Zach nodded, his eyes taking in the humble surroundings. Ready when you are, Miss Jones. As they descended the stairs, Victoria saw Mr. Dawson, the saloon owner, watching them with narrowed eyes. She knew she'd likely lost her job, but in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to care. Outside, the night air had cooled considerably. Victoria pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as they walked toward Front Street. How long have you been in Council Bluffs? Zach asked, carrying her bundle with ease. Almost a year now, Victoria replied. My father passed last winter. He was a school teacher, but the consumption took him quickly. There were debts I didn't know about. Zach nodded, understanding in his eyes. And your mother? Gone since I was 12. It was just Pa and me for a long time. Victoria swallowed the familiar ache of loss. What about you? What brings you to town? Just passing through, Zach said. Been working cattle drives between Texas and Kansas City for the past few years. Thought I'd head north for a change. They arrived at Martha's shop, a modest building with living quarters above. Despite the late hour, a lamp still burned in the window. Victoria knocked, and moments later, a plump woman in her 40s opened the door, her face creasing with concern when she saw Victoria. Tori, what's happened, dear? Martha's eyes darted suspiciously to Zach. Martha, this is Mr. Quinn. He helped me when Bart Hollister... Victoria's voice faltered. Understanding dawned in Martha's eyes. She opened the door wider. Come in, both of you. You look like you could use some tea. Inside, Martha bustled about her small kitchen, while Victoria explained the night's events. Zach stood respectfully by the door, hat in hand, declining a chair until Martha insisted. That Hollister's been nothing but trouble since he arrived, Martha said, setting cups of steaming tea before them. Thinks his money gives him the right to do as he pleases. Does he have family in town? Zach asked. Martha shook her head. No, but he's got men on his payroll, rough sorts, who do his bidding. The sheriff won't cross him either, not since Hollister helped finance his campaign. Victoria felt her heart sink. If Hollister truly held such influence, her position in town was precarious at best. You can stay here as long as you need, Martha told Victoria, patting her hand. The spare room is yours. Thank you, Victoria said gratefully. I'll find new work as soon as possible. Zach cleared his throat. Miss Jones, if I may, I don't think it's safe for you to remain in Council Bluffs. Hollister doesn't strike me as a man who forgets a slight. Martha nodded grimly. He's right, Tori. The man holds grudges like others hold gold. Victoria felt her newfound security crumbling. But where would I go? I hardly have enough money to last a week, let alone start over somewhere new. Zach set his cup down, his expression thoughtful. I have a proposition. I'm heading to a small ranch near North Platte, Nebraska. My uncle left it to me when he passed last year. I've been meaning to settle there, see if I can make something of it. He met Victoria's eyes. It needs a lot of work, and I could use a housekeeper. The pay wouldn't be much at first, but you'd have room and board, and most importantly, you'd be far from Hollister's reach. Victoria stared at him, startled by the offer. You'd take a complete stranger to your home? You'd be an employee, Miss Jones, Zach clarified, his tone respectful. Nothing improper, and Martha here can vouch for my character. If she's willing to send a letter to my former employer in Kansas City. Man named Thomas Mercer runs the largest cattle operation this side of the Mississippi. Martha studied Zach closely. Mercer, you say? I have a cousin in Kansas City who's mentioned that name. Zach nodded. I worked for him 5 seasons. He'll tell you I'm honest, if nothing else. Victoria's mind raced. The offer was both terrifying and tempting. Leave everything behind, travel with a man she'd just met to a place she'd never seen. Yet the alternative, staying in Council Bluffs with Hollister's threat looming, seemed equally daunting. When would you be leaving? She asked finally. Day after tomorrow, Zach replied. I need to gather supplies first. I need time to think about it, Victoria said, her voice steadier than she felt. Martha squeezed her hand. Sleep on it, dear. Things often seem clearer in the morning. Zach rose to leave. I'm staying at the Frontier Hotel. If you decide to accept, you can find me there tomorrow. He placed his hat on his head. Either way, Miss Jones, I wish you well. After he left, Martha turned to Victoria with raised eyebrows. Well, he's certainly handsome. Despite everything, Victoria felt a blush creep into her cheeks. That's hardly relevant, Martha. Oh, I saw how you looked at him. Martha smiled knowingly. And how he looked at you. Victoria shook her head. He was just being kind. Men like that don't offer jobs to women they've just met out of simple kindness, Martha countered. But that aside, his offer makes sense. Council Bluffs isn't safe for you anymore, not with Hollister's influence. That night, Victoria lay awake in Martha's spare room, her mind tumbling with possibilities. The sensible part of her said staying with Martha and finding new work was the safest option. But another part, a part that sounded suspiciously like her father's voice, whispered that sometimes safety wasn't everything. That sometimes you had to take risks to find your true path. By morning, she'd made her decision. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Victoria arrived at the Frontier Hotel. She found Zach in the dining room, nursing a cup of coffee and studying a worn map. Good morning, Mr. Quinn, she said, approaching his table. He looked up, surprise and something else, pleasure, perhaps crossing his features. Miss Jones, you're up early. I've been thinking about your offer, she said, sitting across from him at his gesture. I'd like to accept, with a few conditions. Zach set down his coffee cup. I'm listening. First, I want a written agreement stating the terms of my employment, wages, duties, and the understanding that I'm free to leave whenever I choose. Victoria met his gaze steadily. Second, I want references not just from Mr. Mercer, but from others who can speak to your character. Zach's lips twitched into a smile. You're thorough, Miss Jones. I've had to be, she replied simply. Both reasonable requests, he said with a nod. Anything else? Victoria hesitated. Just one more thing. I want your word that you'll respect my privacy and my person. Zach's expression grew serious. You have it. No harm will come to you while you're under my roof or in my employment. That's a promise. There was something in his eyes, a steadiness, an integrity that Victoria couldn't help but trust. She extended her hand across the table. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Quinn. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. Zach, he reminded her, if we're going to be working together, you might as well use my name. Tori, she offered in return, a small smile touching her lips. Their hands remained clasped a moment longer than necessary before Victoria withdrew hers, suddenly aware of the warmth spreading through her chest. We leave tomorrow at first light, Zach said, returning to his map. It's about a week's journey if the weather holds. Victoria nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. I'll be ready. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect for travel. Victoria said her tearful goodbyes to Martha, promising to write as soon as they reached North Platte. Martha pressed a small package into her hands, bread and cheese for the journey, along with a new bonnet she'd been saving for Victoria's birthday. Zach was waiting outside with a wagon loaded with supplies and pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He'd also secured a gentle mare for Victoria to ride alongside when she tired of the wagon. Her name's Penny, Zach said as he helped Victoria mount. She's even tempered and smart. Victoria patted the horse's neck, grateful for Zach's consideration. She'd ridden before her father had insisted she learn, but it had been years. As they left Council Bluffs behind, Victoria felt a curious mix of emotions: relief at escaping Hollister's reach, sadness at leaving the only home she'd known since her father's death, and an undeniable flutter of anticipation, when she glanced at Zach's profile against the morning sky. The first few days of their journey passed uneventfully. They traveled at a steady pace, making camp each evening by a water source when possible. Zach proved to be a competent camp cook, and Victoria found herself enjoying their simple meals under the stars more than any fancy dinner she could remember. They talked easily, learning about each other in the unhurried way of travelers with time to spare. Zach told her about growing up on his family's small farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to fever when he was 19, about working his way west with nothing but determination and a good horse. "My uncle Jeremiah, the one who left me the ranch, he was my mother's brother," Zach explained on their third night out. "Visited us once when I was a boy. He was a character full of stories about the West, about building something from nothing." "Is that what you want to do? Build something from nothing?" Victoria asked, watching him across the campfire. Zach nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Always have. It's why I saved every penny from those cattle drives. I want land of my own, a place that can't be taken away." He glanced at her. "What about you? What did you want before life took a turn?" Victoria looked up at the vast canopy of stars. "I wanted to teach, like my father. He was educating me at home, preparing me to take examinations for a teaching certificate." She smiled wistfully. "I still have his books. It's silly, I suppose, holding on to that dream." "Not silly at all," Zach said quietly. "Dreams are what keep us going when times get hard." Their eyes met across the fire, and Victoria felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. She looked away first, suddenly conscious of how alone they were under the endless prairie sky. On the fourth day, the weather turned. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and by midday rain began to fall, a gentle shower at first. Then a steady downpour that soaked through their clothes and made the trail muddy and treacherous. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles ahead," Zach called over the drumming rain. "Used to belong to the Bar K Ranch. Should give us shelter till this passes." Victoria nodded, too wet and miserable to speak. Her hair hung in sodden ropes around her face, and her dress felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a sagging roof, but it was dry inside, and the small stone fireplace was intact. Zach worked quickly to start a fire, while Victoria stood shivering by the door, water pooling at her feet. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Zach said, not looking at her as he built up the flames. "I'll step outside while you change." "You're just as wet," Victoria protested. "You'll catch your death." "I'll change after you," he insisted, already heading for the door. "There's a blanket in my bedroll that should still be dry. Take your time." Alone in the cabin, Victoria peeled off her sodden dress and petticoats, hanging them near the fire to dry. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket from Zach's bedroll, grateful for its warmth and the lingering scent of leather and pine that she'd come to associate with him. "Decent?" Zach called from outside after several minutes. "Yes," she answered, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. He entered, water streaming from his hat and coat. His eyes flickered briefly to her bare shoulders above the blanket before he deliberately looked away. "Fire's taking nicely," he commented, removing his dripping hat and coat. Victoria turned to face the fire, giving him privacy to change. She heard the rustle of fabric, the squelch of wet boots being removed, and tried not to think about the man undressing just feet away from her. "All right," he said after a moment. Victoria turned to find him dressed in dry trousers and a flannel shirt. His wet clothes spread beside hers near the fire. His hair was damp and tousled, making him look younger than his 30 years. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the blanket pulled tightly around Victoria's shoulders. Outside, the rain continued to pour, drumming against the roof and occasionally finding its way through small leaks to drip onto the floor. "Looks like we'll be here for the night," Zach said, watching the weather through the cabin's single small window. "Rain's not letting up anytime soon." Victoria nodded, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation. They'd spent nights in close proximity on the trail, but always with the vast open sky above them and a proper campfire between them. This being confined in a small cabin, with her dressed only in her chemise and drawers beneath a blanket, was different. Zach seemed to sense her unease. "I'll sleep by the door," he said, arranging his bedroll on the dirt floor, as far from her as the small cabin would allow. You take the spot by the fire." "Thank you," Victoria said softly, touched by his consideration. As night fell, the rain intensified, accompanied now by gusts of wind that rattled the cabin's weathered boards. Victoria lay awake on her bedroll, listening to the storm and to Zach's steady breathing across the room. Despite her exhaustion from the day's journey, sleep eluded her. "Zach," she whispered into the darkness, unsure if he was awake. "Yes?" His response was immediate, his voice low and clear. "Why did you really offer me a position? You could have just helped me that night and gone on your way." There was a long silence, broken only by the pattering of rain and the occasional crack of the settling fire. "When I saw Hollister dragging you like that," Zach finally said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "it reminded me of something I saw as a boy, a neighbor who treated his wife cruelly. My father intervened once. But the woman had nowhere to go, no family to take her in. She stayed, and eventually, the man killed her." He paused. "I couldn't just leave you in a similar situation, not when I had the means to help." Victoria absorbed his words, her heart aching for both the unknown woman and for the boy who had witnessed such cruelty. "I'm sorry you had to see that. It taught me something important," Zach said, "that sometimes doing the right thing means more than just stopping immediate harm. Sometimes it means offering a way out." "Is that all it was?" Victoria asked, emboldened by the darkness. "Just doing the right thing?" Another pause, longer this time. "No," Zach admitted finally. "There was something about you, Victoria Jones. Something that made me want to know you better." The simple honesty of his words made Victoria's breath catch. "I felt it too," she whispered, surprised by her own candor. "That's why I decided to come with you." The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. In its dying light, Victoria could just make out Zach's silhouette as he sat up on his bedroll. "We should get some sleep," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Long day tomorrow, once this rain clears." "Yes," Victoria agreed, though sleep now seemed more impossible than ever. "Good night, Zach." "Good night, Tori." As she finally drifted off to sleep, Victoria realized with startling clarity that somewhere between Council Bluffs and this leaky cabin in the middle of nowhere, her feelings for Zachariah Quinn had grown into something far more complicated than gratitude or professional respect. The rain continued through the night, but had tapered to a gentle mist by morning. They set out after a simple breakfast, their clothes still damp but wearable. The trail had turned to mud, slowing their progress considerably. By midday, they had covered less than half the distance they had managed on previous days. "We'll need to find higher ground for tonight," Zach said, surveying the sodden landscape. "This whole area could flood if the rain returns." Victoria nodded, too focused on keeping her mare from slipping in the mud to reply. Her hands were stiff with cold, and her back ached from hours in the saddle. Yet, despite her discomfort, she found herself strangely content. There was something freeing about leaving civilization behind, about having nothing but the horizon ahead and Zach beside her. They made camp that evening on a small rise overlooking a creek swollen with rainwater. The ground was relatively dry, protected by a stand of cottonwood trees. As Zach prepared their evening meal, Victoria took the opportunity to brush and braid her hair, which had become hopelessly tangled during the day's journey. "Here, let me help," Zach offered, noticing her struggling with a particularly stubborn knot. Before Victoria could protest, he was beside her, gently taking the brush from her hands. "My sister used to let me brush her hair when we were children," he explained, working carefully through the tangled strands. "Said I had a gentler touch than our mother." Victoria sat perfectly still, acutely aware of his presence behind her, of his fingers occasionally brushing against her neck. No man had touched her hair since her father had plaited it for school when she was a little girl. The intimacy of the gesture made her heart race. "There," Zach said after several minutes, handing the brush back to her. "All the knots are gone." "Thank you," Victoria replied, unable to meet his eyes as she quickly braided her hair. That night, as they sat by the fire finishing the last of their coffee, Zach pointed to a bright star just visible through the tree branches. "North Star," he said. "My uncle taught me that, as long as you can find that star, you're never truly lost." Victoria tilted her head back, studying the pinprick of light. "My father used to say something similar about books. that as long as you have books, your mind can never be truly lost. Zach smiled. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, Victoria agreed, a familiar pang of loss squeezing her heart. I miss him every day. Tell me about him, Zach encouraged, settling back against his saddle. And so she did. Victoria spoke of her father's passion for learning, his kindness to his students, his love of Shakespeare and Dickens. She told Zach about the long evenings they'd spent reading aloud to each other after her mother died, about his patient teaching, and about his slow decline as consumption ravaged his once robust frame. He made me promise to live fully, Victoria said, wiping away a stray tear. His last words to me were, "Don't just exist, Tori, live." Zach was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, I think he'd be proud of you. Taking this journey, starting fresh, that's living. Victoria smiled through her tears. I hope so. They fell silent, the crackling fire and distant call of a night bird, the only sounds in the vast darkness. Victoria felt a curious peace settle over her, as if sharing her memories of her father had somehow lightened the burden of grief she'd carried for so long. We should reach North Platte in 3 days if the weather holds, Zach said finally. The ranch is about 10 miles west of town. What's it like? Victoria asked. The ranch, I mean? Zach's expression grew thoughtful. Small compared to some. About 160 acres, with a creek running through the southern portion. The house is modest, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. There's a barn, a corral, and a small bunkhouse. Though I don't expect to need hands for a while yet. Victoria tried to picture it. Sounds peaceful. It needs work, Zach admitted. My uncle was getting on in years, and some things fell into disrepair. But the bones are good, and the land is fertile. It could be something special, with time and care. The way he spoke about the ranch with hope and determination made Victoria believe in his vision. She could see it in her mind's eye. Fields of waving grass, cattle grazing peacefully, smoke rising from the chimney of a snug house. I'll help, she found herself saying, not just with the housekeeping, but with whatever needs doing. I'm stronger than I look, and I'm a quick learner. Zach studied her face in the firelight, something warm kindling in his eyes. I believe you are, Victoria Jones. I believe you are. The next day dawned clear and bright, as if the rain had washed the world clean. They made good progress, the trail gradually rising as they approached the rolling hills that separated the flat prairie from the more rugged terrain near North Platte. That evening, as they set up camp by a small stream, Victoria noticed Zach watching her with an odd expression. What is it? She asked, self-consciously tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Nothing, he said quickly, then seemed to reconsider. Actually, I was just thinking that you don't look like the same woman I met in Council Bluffs. Victoria glanced down at her travel-worn dress and dusty boots. I suppose I must look a fright after days on the trail. No, Zach shook his head. That's not what I meant. You look freer, like you've shed something heavy you were carrying. Victoria considered his words, surprised to realize the truth in them, the tightness she'd carried in her shoulders since her father's death, the constant anxiety of making ends meet. The wariness that came from fending off unwanted advances at the saloon, all had gradually eased during their journey. I feel different, she admitted. Less afraid, perhaps. Zach nodded, satisfaction in his expression. Good. Fear's no way to live. That night, Victoria dreamed of the ranch of sunlight streaming through windows, of bread baking in an oven, of Zach's smile as he came in from the fields. She woke before dawn, the dream still vivid in her mind, and was startled to find Zach already awake, watching her from across the remains of their fire. You were smiling in your sleep, he said softly. Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks. Was I? I was dreaming of... She hesitated, suddenly shy. Of the ranch. Of what it might be like. And was it good? This dream ranch of yours? Yes, she whispered. Very good. Something passed between them then, an unspoken understanding that perhaps they shared the same vision. But neither put it into words, and soon they were busy breaking camp and preparing for another day's journey. The following afternoon, they crested a hill to find the North Platte River Valley spread before them, the town visible as a cluster of buildings nestled against the meandering waterway. "North Platte," Zach announced, a note of pride in his voice. "We'll stop there for supplies, then head to the ranch tomorrow." Victoria felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with nervousness. Their journey was coming to an end, and soon they would be at the ranch alone together, in a way they hadn't been even on the trail. What would it be like, living under the same roof, working side by side each day? North Platte proved to be a bustling town, larger than Victoria had expected. The railroad had brought prosperity, evident in the brick storefronts and busy streets. They stopped first at the general store, where Zach purchased flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples they would need. "Mr. Quinn," the storekeeper, a rotund man with impressive side whiskers, greeted Zach warmly. "Heard you might be coming back to stay this time." "That's right, Mr. Finch," Zach confirmed, shaking the man's hand. "Going to see what I can make of my uncle's place." Mr. Finch's eyes drifted to Victoria. "And who might this young lady be?" "This is Miss Victoria Jones," Zach said. "She'll be keeping house for me." Victoria noticed the slight narrowing of Mr. Finch's eyes and felt a flash of embarrassment. Of course, a single woman traveling with a single man would raise eyebrows, even with the explanation of employment. "Miss Jones." Mr. Finch nodded politely, though his expression remained speculative. They made several more stops at the blacksmith's to arrange for horseshoes, at the lumber yard to order materials for repairs, and finally at a small dress shop where Zach insisted on purchasing fabric for Victoria to make new clothes. "Consider it an advance on your wages," he said when she protested. "You'll need proper work dresses for the ranch." By the time they checked into the town's only hotel, Zach taking a room at one end of the hallway, Victoria at the other, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "We'll leave for the ranch after breakfast," Zach told her as they parted at her door. "It's about 2 hours' ride from here." Victoria nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what she'd done, traveling across 2 states with a man she barely knew, to live in isolation at a remote ranch. Was she being incredibly brave or incredibly foolish? "Zach," she said impulsively as he turned to go, "thank you. For everything." He looked back at her, his eyes softening. "No need for thanks, Tori. Get some rest." Alone in her room, Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the clean quilt. After nights on the ground, the mattress felt impossibly soft. She should have been exhausted, but instead found herself too wound up to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of the ranch, of the new life awaiting her, and, most persistently, of Zach. There was no denying it any longer. Her feelings for him had grown far beyond what was appropriate for an employer. In the quiet darkness of her hotel room, Victoria admitted to herself that she was falling in love with Zachariah Quinn. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. He had given no indication that he felt the same way. He had been unfailingly kind and respectful, yes, but that could simply be his nature. The thought of living with him day after day, hiding her growing affection, seemed suddenly daunting. Victoria rose from the bed and went to the window, looking out at the now darkened town. Perhaps she should reconsider. North Platte seemed prosperous. Surely there would be work here, a way to support herself without the complication of unrequited feelings. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Victoria hesitated, then crossed the room and opened the door a crack to find Zach standing there, hat in hand. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "But I realize there's something I need to tell you before we reach the ranch tomorrow." Victoria's heart raced as she opened the door wider. "What is it?" Zach glanced down the empty hallway. "May I come in? Just for a moment." Propriety dictated she refuse, but Victoria found herself stepping aside to let him enter. She left the door ajar, however a concession to convention. Zach stood awkwardly in the center of the small room, turning his hat in his hands. "The thing is, Tori, I haven't been entirely honest with you about the ranch." Victoria felt a chill of apprehension. "What do you mean?" "It's not just that it needs repairs. The truth is it's been abandoned for nearly 2 years. My uncle's death was sudden, and by the time I learned of my inheritance, winter had set in. I couldn't get there until spring, and even then, I could only stay a few days before I had to return to my job with Mercer." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated with himself. What I'm trying to say is that the place is in worse shape than I let on. The roof leaks, the corral fences are down in places, and the fields have gone wild. It's going to be hard work, harder than I implied. Victoria felt herself relax slightly. Is that all? Zach, I'm not afraid of hard work. That's not everything, he admitted, his eyes meeting hers directly now. The house, it's not fit for a lady. Not yet. There's only one bedroom that doesn't have a damaged roof, and the kitchen. He shook his head. I should have told you sooner, given you the chance to stay in town until I could make proper repairs. Victoria considered his words. Where will you sleep if there's only one sound bedroom? The bunkhouse is weathertight. I'll bunk there until I can repair the second bedroom. And you're telling me this now because... Zach's expression grew earnest. Because I want you to have the choice, Tori. You can stay here in North Platte, find respectable work, I'll help you with that, if you'd like. Or you can still come to the ranch, but with a clear understanding of what you're getting into. Victoria studied his face in the lamplight, touched by his concern and his honesty, belated though it was. Thank you for telling me, but my decision hasn't changed. I'll come to the ranch and help you rebuild it. Relief washed over Zach's features. You're sure? I'm sure, Victoria confirmed, more certain than ever that she was making the right choice. After all, your uncle built it from nothing once. We can do it again. Zach's eyes widened slightly at her use of we, but he nodded, a smile spreading across his face. We certainly can. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. There's one more thing you should know. What's that? His expression grew serious again. The reason I offered you the position, it wasn't just because of what happened with Hollister, or because I needed a housekeeper. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. No? No, Zach said softly. There was something about you, Victoria Jones. Something that made me think you'd understand what I'm trying to build out there. A home, not just a ranch. A place where... He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. A place where what? Victoria prompted, barely breathing. A place where someone could put down roots, start a family, eventually. Zach's gaze was steady on hers. I know it's too soon to speak of such things. We barely know each other. But I wanted you to understand that I see possibilities, Tori. For the ranch and for us. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. I see them too, she whispered. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared confession hanging between them. Then Zach stepped back, a gentle smile touching his lips. We should get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. Victoria nodded, unable to find her voice. As Zach moved to leave, he hesitated at the threshold, then quickly, almost shyly, reached out to squeeze her hand before disappearing down the hallway. Alone again, Victoria closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Zach saw possibilities for them together. The thought was both wonderful and terrifying. What if they reached the ranch only to discover they couldn't live harmoniously? What if his feelings changed once the novelty of her company wore off? Yet, despite these fears, Victoria found herself smiling into the darkness. For the first time since her father's death, she felt hope, real hope, for the future. Whatever challenges awaited at the ranch, they would face them together. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Victoria dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but was at least clean and pressed. She pinned her hair neatly and packed her few belongings, ready to begin this new chapter of her life. Zach was waiting in the hotel dining room, already finished with his breakfast. He stood when he saw her, and Victoria was struck again by how handsome he was, not in the flashy way of the dandies who sometimes pass through Council Bluffs, but with a rugged, honest appeal that made her heart beat faster. Good morning, he greeted her, pulling out a chair. Did you sleep well? Eventually, Victoria admitted with a small smile. My mind was too full for easy sleep. Zach nodded in understanding. Mine as well. They ate breakfast mostly in silence, both seemingly lost in their own thoughts. As they finished, Zach glanced at the clock on the wall. The wagon's loaded and ready. We can leave whenever you're ready. Victoria took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. I'm ready now. The ride to the ranch took them west from North Platte, following the river for several miles before turning north into gently rolling hills covered with prairie grass and scattered stands of cottonwoods and elms. As they crested a particularly high rise, Zach reined in his horse. "There it is," he said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley below. Quinn Ranch. Victoria shaded her eyes against the morning sun, taking in her first view of what would be her new home. Even from a distance, she could see that Zach hadn't exaggerated the ranch's condition. The main house, a modest two-story structure of weathered wood, showed clear signs of neglect. One section of the roof had partially collapsed, and the front porch sagged noticeably. The barn and corral fared somewhat better, though several fence posts had fallen. Yet, despite its dilapidated state, there was something inherently appealing about the setting, the way the buildings nestled against the backdrop of rolling hills, the silver ribbon of a creek winding through the property, the vast open sky above. "It's beautiful," Victoria said truthfully. Zach glanced at her, surprise and pleasure mingling in his expression. "You think so, even with all the work it needs?" "Because of all the work it needs," Victoria replied. "It's waiting for us to bring it back to life." Zach's face broke into a broad smile that made Victoria's heart flutter. "That's exactly how I feel." They continued down the hill, the wagon rattling over the uneven ground. As they approached the ranch yard, Victoria could see the details more clearly: the peeling paint on the house, the overgrown garden plot, the well with its weathered cover. Zach helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist, perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Let me show you around," he said, an edge of nervous excitement in his voice. They started with the house. The front door stuck slightly, and Zach had to put his shoulder to it to push it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through dirty windows. The sitting room was sparsely furnished with a worn sofa, a rocking chair, and a small table. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with a few tarnished candlesticks, and a faded daguerreotype of a stern-faced man Victoria assumed was Zach's uncle. "Kitchen's through here," Zach said, leading the way. The kitchen was larger than Victoria had expected, with a sturdy wood-burning stove, a pump sink, and a large table that could seat at least 6. Cupboards lined one wall, their doors hanging slightly askew. "The stove works well," Zach told her. "I checked it when I was here in the spring. The pump needs priming, but the well water is sweet." Victoria nodded, already mentally cataloging what needed to be cleaned, repaired, or replaced. Despite the dust and disarray, she could see the potential with scrubbing, paint, and care. This kitchen could become the heart of a home. "And upstairs?" she asked. Zach led her back to the main room and up a narrow staircase. "2 bedrooms," he explained. "The one at the back is where the roof's damaged. This one's sound." He opened a door to reveal a modest bedroom with a double bed, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk beneath a window that overlooked the creek. The bedding had been stripped and dust covered every surface, but the room was structurally intact. "This will be your room," Zach said. "I brought fresh bedding from town, and there's a washstand in the corner. It's not much, but—" "It's perfect," Victoria interrupted. And strangely, despite its shabby condition, it was. The room had good bones, as Zach might say. With cleaning and a few feminine touches, it would be more than adequate. They completed the tour with the barn, bunkhouse, and outbuildings, all in various states of disrepair, but fundamentally sound. By the time they returned to the wagon to unload their supplies, Victoria's mind was racing with plans and possibilities. "It's a lot to take in," Zach said, watching her expression carefully. "If you're having second thoughts—" Victoria shook her head firmly. "Not at all. I'm just making mental lists of what needs doing first." Relief and something warmer flickered in Zach's eyes. "And what's your verdict?" "The house first," Victoria decided. "We need a clean, dry place to sleep and eat. The kitchen and your bedroom are priorities. The rest can wait." Zach nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "My thoughts exactly." He hesitated, then added, "It means a lot, Tori, having someone who sees the potential here, who doesn't just see the work ahead, but what it could become." Victoria felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I've always believed that anything worth having is worth working for." "So have I," Zach said quietly, his eyes holding hers for a long moment before he turned back to the wagon. "Let's get these supplies inside before the day gets any hotter." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Victoria tackled the house room by room, starting with the kitchen. She scrubbed every surface until her hands were raw, washed windows until they sparkled, and arranged their meager supplies in the newly cleaned cupboards. Zach worked on the structural repairs, patching the roof over the damaged bedroom and reinforcing the sagging porch. They fell into an easy rhythm, working separately during the day, but coming together for meals. Victoria found she enjoyed cooking for Zach, taking pride in creating satisfying meals from their simple provisions. In the evenings, they would sit on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset and sharing stories of their day's progress. On the fourth day, Zach rode into town for more supplies, leaving Victoria alone at the ranch for the first time. After seeing him off, she returned to the house, struck by the silence that seemed to settle over the place in his absence. She kept busy, attacking the dust and cobwebs in the sitting room, but found herself pausing occasionally to glance out the window, searching the horizon for signs of his return. It was during one of these moments, as she stood at the sitting room window with a dustcloth in hand, that Victoria fully acknowledged the truth she'd been dancing around for days. She wasn't just attracted to Zach, wasn't just fond of him. She was falling deeply, irrevocably in love with him. The realization should have frightened her. After all, they'd known each other barely 2 weeks. Yet, instead of fear, Victoria felt a curious sense of rightness, as if she'd finally recognized something that had been true all along. When Zach returned late that afternoon, the wagon loaded with lumber, nails, paint, and food supplies, Victoria found herself hurrying to meet him, unable to contain her smile. "Successful trip?" she called as he pulled the wagon into the yard. Zach's face lit up at the sight of her, and Victoria's heart skipped. "Very," he confirmed, setting the brake and jumping down. "Got everything on our list, and then some. Mr. Finch sends his regards." As they unloaded the supplies, their hands brushed occasionally, each touch sending a thrill through Victoria. She wondered if Zach felt it too, this growing awareness between them, this pull that seemed to strengthen with each passing day. That evening, after a simple supper of beans, bacon, and cornbread, they sat on the porch as usual. The air was unusually still, heavy with the promise of summer heat to come. Fireflies blinked in the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "I was thinking," Zach said after a companionable silence, "about planting a vegetable garden. It's late in the season, but we might still get a crop of quick-growing things. Radishes, lettuce, maybe some peas." Victoria nodded, picturing it. "We could put it where your uncle's garden was. The soil looked good there, just overgrown." "Exactly what I was thinking," Zach agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I like that you say we." Victoria glanced at him, finding his eyes already on her, warm in the fading light. "It feels like a we kind of place," she said softly. Zach's hand moved across the space between them, on the porch step, covering hers. His palm was calloused, but gentle. "It does, doesn't it?" Victoria turned her hand over, threading her fingers through his. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Their joined hands a silent acknowledgement of what was growing between them. The next morning, Zach announced his intention to ride the property boundaries, checking fences and getting a better sense of the land's condition. "I'll be gone most of the day," he told Victoria over breakfast. "Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course," she assured him. "I have plenty to keep me busy." After he left, Victoria turned her attention to the damaged bedroom. Zach had repaired the roof, but the room itself needed thorough cleaning before it could be used. She spent the morning sweeping, scrubbing, and airing out the musty bedding, pausing occasionally to gaze out the window at the beautiful landscape that stretched in all directions. Around midday, as Victoria was hanging the freshly washed curtains, she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Thinking Zach had returned early, she went to the window, a smile already forming. Instead of Zach, however, she saw 3 riders approaching the ranch house strangers. Victoria's first instinct was caution. She and Zach were isolated here, miles from town. Visitors were unlikely to be casual social calls. She quickly finished hanging the curtain and went downstairs, pausing at the bottom to take a deep breath and smooth her apron. The riders were in the yard now, dismounting near the water trough. Two were clearly ranch hands, rough-looking men in their 30s, dusty from the trail. The third was better dressed, a man of perhaps 50 with a neat beard and a confident bearing. Victoria stepped onto the porch just as the well-dressed man approached the house. He stopped at the bottom step, removing his hat. "Good day, madam," he said, his tone polite but assessing. "I'm looking for the owner of this property." "Mr. Quinn is not currently at home," Victoria replied, keeping her voice steady despite her unease. "He's riding the boundaries today. I'm Victoria Jones, the housekeeper." Something flickered in the man's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Frank Morrison," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "I own the Double M Ranch, bordering this property to the north." He gestured to the men behind him. "My foreman, Jenkins, and one of my hands." Victoria nodded acknowledgement, but remained on the porch, maintaining the height advantage. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Morrison?" Morrison smiled thinly. "I was hoping to speak with Quinn about business. I wasn't aware he'd taken up residence. Last I heard, this place was abandoned. Mr. Quinn inherited it from his uncle and has recently decided to make it his home," Victoria explained, choosing her words carefully. Something about Morrison's manner made her wary. "I see." Morrison studied the house and outbuildings with obvious interest. "Well, when he returns, please tell him I stopped by. I'd be interested in discussing the possibility of purchasing this property. I could make him a fair offer, certainly more than this rundown place is worth." Victoria stiffened at his dismissive tone. "Mr. Quinn has no intention of selling. He's invested in restoring the ranch to working order." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so? Well, intentions can change when confronted with reality. Ranching is hard work, especially for a man on his own." "He's not on his own," Victoria said firmly, "and Mr. Quinn isn't afraid of hard work." Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "No offense intended, Miss Jones, but a housekeeper and a single rancher aren't likely to make much of this place. The last few years have been hard on small operations. Drought, harsh winters, it takes capital to weather those storms." Before Victoria could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Zach rode into the yard, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. He dismounted quickly, handing his reins to the post and striding toward the house. "Morrison," he said tersely, coming to stand beside Victoria on the porch. "What brings you to my property?" So Zach knew this man, Victoria realized, feeling a surge of relief at his presence. "Quinn," Morrison nodded, his manner cooling noticeably. "I was just telling your housekeeper that I'd be interested in discussing the purchase of this place." Zach's jaw tightened. "Not interested. You haven't heard my offer." "Don't need to," Zach replied evenly. "This land isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "That's short-sighted. You know as well as I do that small ranches like this are dying out. Another drought like last year's, and you'll be begging for an offer half as generous as what I'd give you now." Victoria felt Zach tense beside her, but admired the way he kept his composure. "I appreciate your concern for my financial future," he said dryly, "but I'll take my chances. Now, if you don't mind, Miss Jones and I have work to do." Morrison replaced his hat, his expression hardening. "Think about it, Quinn. A smart man knows when to cut his losses." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at Victoria. "Good day, Miss Jones. A pleasure to meet you, despite the circumstances." Victoria merely nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They watched in silence as Morrison and his men mounted and rode away, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Only when they were well out of sight did Zach's rigid posture relax slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning to Victoria with concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," she assured him. They weren't threatening, just presumptuous. Zach's mouth twisted in a grimace. "That's Frank Morrison's specialty. He's been trying to buy this land since before my uncle died. Wants to expand his operation, and our creek makes this property valuable." Victoria led the way inside, where the kitchen was cooler. "How do you know him?" "Met him in town last spring when I came to check on the place after my uncle died," Zach explained, accepting the glass of water Victoria poured for him. "He wasted no time making an offer then, too. Seemed genuinely surprised when I turned him down." "He doesn't strike me as a man used to hearing no," Victoria observed. Zach smiled grimly. He's not. Morrison's used to getting his way in these parts. He's got money, influence, and enough hired hands to make most folks think twice about crossing him. A chill ran through Victoria at his words. Is he dangerous? Zach considered the question. Not overtly, he's too concerned with his reputation for that. But he plays rough when it comes to business. He looked at her intently. If he ever comes around again when I'm not here, be careful what you say to him. Morrison has a way of using people's words against them. Victoria nodded, understanding the warning. I'll be careful. Zach reached across the table, taking her hand. I'm sorry you had to deal with him alone. I should have warned you that he might come calling. You couldn't have known, Victoria said, squeezing his hand reassuringly. Besides, I can handle myself. Zach's expression softened as he looked at her. Yes, you certainly can, Victoria Jones. The incident with Morrison cast a subtle shadow over the days that followed. Though they didn't discuss it further, Victoria noticed that Zach seemed more vigilant, often pausing in his work to scan the horizon or check that his rifle was loaded and within reach. For her part, Victoria found herself listening more carefully to the sounds of the ranch, startling at unexpected noises. Yet, despite this undercurrent of tension, their work continued. The damaged bedroom was now clean and habitable, allowing Zach to move from the bunkhouse into the main house. They planted the vegetable garden together, Zach turning the soil while Victoria carefully set seeds into neat rows. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, talking of their progress and their plans for the ranch's future. It was during one such evening, about 2 weeks after Morrison's visit, that Zach broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. Tori, he began, using the familiar name that had become his preference. There's something I need to discuss with you. Victoria looked up from her mending, noting the seriousness in his tone. What is it? Zach seemed to choose his words carefully. I've been thinking about our arrangement, about you being here as my housekeeper. Victoria's heart sank. Was he unhappy with her work? Did he regret bringing her here? Is something wrong? No, Zach said quickly. Just the opposite. You've been incredible. This place, it's already becoming what I hoped it could be. And that's largely thanks to you. He took a deep breath. But Morrison's visit made me realize something. People are going to talk. A single woman living with a single man, miles from town, even with you officially as my housekeeper. It puts your reputation at risk. Victoria set her mending aside. I'm not concerned about gossip, Zach. You should be, he said gently. Out here, a woman's reputation is sometimes all she has. If things went badly between us, if you wanted to leave, you'd find it hard to secure respectable employment if your name was tarnished. Victoria felt a flicker of alarm. Are you asking me to leave? No, Zach said firmly. God, no. That's the last thing I want. He moved closer to her on the porch step, taking her hands in his. What I'm trying to say badly is that I care about you, Tori. More than as an employee, more than as a friend even. Victoria's breath caught. Zach. Let me finish, he said, his eyes intent on hers. I know it's soon. Too soon, probably. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. When I saw you in that saloon, something happened to me, and every day since, my feelings have only grown stronger. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that glinted in the fading light, a simple gold band. It was my mother's, he explained, his voice rough with emotion. I've carried it with me since she died, waiting for the right person. He met Victoria's eyes, his own full of hope and vulnerability. I'm asking if you'll marry me, Victoria Jones, not just to protect your reputation, though that matters to me, but because I've fallen in love with you and I want to build this life, this ranch, this home together, as husband and wife. Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes, a tangle of emotions making speech impossible for a moment. Joy, disbelief, overwhelming love, they crashed through her like a summer storm. Yes, she finally whispered, her voice breaking. Yes, Zachariah Quinn, I'll marry you. Zach's face broke into a smile of such pure happiness that Victoria's heart seemed to expand in her chest. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose but would do until they could have it sized, and then drew her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Victoria felt herself melting against him, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders as his arms tightened around her waist. When they finally parted, both were breathing unevenly, wonder in their eyes. "I love you," Victoria said, the words she'd held back for so long finally finding voice. "I think I've loved you since that night in Council Bluffs, when you stood between me and harm without a thought for yourself." Zach touched her cheek reverently. "And I've loved you since I saw you stand up to Hollister, dignity intact despite everything. You're the bravest woman I've ever known," Victoria Jones. They were married 2 weeks later in North Platte, with Martha having traveled all the way from Council Bluffs to stand as Victoria's witness. The ceremony was simple, the town's minister officiating in his small church with only a handful of attendees, Martha, Mr. Finch from the general store, and a few others from town who had come to know them. Victoria wore a new dress of pale blue cotton, with white lace at the collar that Martha had insisted on adding. Zach looked handsome in a clean black suit that made his shoulders seem even broader than usual. When they spoke their vows, Victoria's voice was clear and sure, her eyes never leaving Zach's. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Zach's kiss was gentle, but held a promise that made Victoria blush when they finally broke apart to the sounds of congratulatory applause. They spent one night at the hotel in North Platte, their wedding night, filled with tender discoveries and whispered words of love before returning to the ranch the following day. As they approached the property, now visible on the horizon, Zach reined in the wagon. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," he said, his voice warm with pride and love. Victoria smiled, happiness bubbling through her veins like champagne. "Home," she repeated, savoring the word. "I like the sound of that." The ranch house looked different to her now, not just a place where she worked, but her home, their home. As Zach helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist, Victoria felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, with this man, on this land. That evening, they sat on their porch truly theirs, now watching the sunset paint the western sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. Zach's arm was around her shoulders, Victoria's head resting comfortably against him. "What are you thinking?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Victoria smiled, contentment warming her from within. "That my father would be happy for me, that I'm finally living, not just existing." Zach tightened his arm around her. "We're just beginning, Tori. Wait until you see what we can build here together." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that the journey that had begun with a violent act in a Council Bluffs saloon had led her exactly where she was meant to be, safe in the arms of a man who would never let her be dragged away again. A man who saw her strength and courage and loved her for it. A man with whom she would build a life filled with love, hard work, and endless possibilities. In the years that followed, the Quinn Ranch prospered under their joint care. The house was fully restored, room by room, until it gleamed with fresh paint and simple but comfortable furnishings. The vegetable garden expanded, providing plenty for their table and extras to trade in town. Zach acquired a small herd of cattle, which grew steadily under his careful management. 2 years after their wedding, Victoria gave birth to a son they named James, after her father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 18 months later. The house, once so empty and neglected, now rang with children's laughter and the sounds of a busy, happy family. Frank Morrison made one more attempt to purchase the ranch, approaching Zach in town with an offer substantially higher than his previous one. Zach's refusal was polite but firm, and something in his manner, perhaps the confidence of a man who knew what he had, was worth more than any price, finally convinced Morrison to look elsewhere for expansion. On warm summer evenings, the Quinn family would often gather on the porch after supper, Zach and Victoria sitting side by side while the children played in the yard. Sometimes they would speak of the future of the children's education, of improvements to the ranch, of dreams still to be fulfilled. Other times they would simply sit in companionable silence, watching the sun set over the land they had made their own. And on nights when the children were asleep and they were alone, Zach would sometimes take Victoria's hand and lead her to the edge of their property where they could see the vast expanse of prairie stretching to the horizon. Under the canopy of stars, he would pull her into his arms and whisper, "Are you happy, Mrs. Quinn?" And Victoria, thinking of the frightened young woman she'd once been, dragged by her hair in a saloon in Council Bluffs, would look up at the man who had saved her not just from Hollister, but from a life half-lived, and answer truthfully, "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." In those moments, with Zach's arms around her and their home waiting nearby, Victoria knew that some journeys, no matter how difficult their beginnings, led exactly where they were meant to love, to home, to the place where your heart can finally rest.